In the summer of 1798, a fleet appeared off the northern coast of Egypt. Yet hardly had this fleet arrived before it turned away and headed back north. For this was not the fleet you might be thinking of. In an incredible campaign over the summer of 1798, the British and the French waged a game of cat and mouse on the high seas of the Mediterranean. That fleet was the British out in search of Napoleon and yet managed to miss him by a mere matter of hours. That game of cat and mouse came to a culmination in a night battle which changed the course of the war in the Mediterranean and unwittingly sowed the seeds of Napoleon's rise. This is the story of the Battle of the Nile. Tonight, acclaimed naval historian Kate Jamieson makes a welcome return to the show as we return to our naval series. We're going to talk about this balls of steel moment, which saw Nelson seize an initiative that few would have expected to materialize, and the impact that this had, not just in the Med, not just in Egypt, but across Europe. This is the Battle of the Nile, up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where on the anniversary of the Battle of the Nile, we're going to talk about the Battle of the Nile. Who says this show is not imaginative? Once again, we are joined by the ever popular naval historian Kate Jamieson, Master Gunner in Chief. What was the name I gave you last time? I think I just called you Master Gunner and
I'll take
Master of
I mean,
Gunner.
that's technically the dog, but yeah, I'll take it.
There we go. Something like that. But it's good to have you back, Kate, as ever. And at some point, we'll do an episode about, well, we'll do multiple episodes about Nelson. We've started drawing up a planner at Napoleonic Wars Pod HQ.
An
And there
ever
are,
increasing planner.
yes, everybody loves a planner, even if it's just to sort of color code it and make it look pretty. But we do have about 6 kind of penciled in as just Kate boaty stuff. So lots for folks to look forward to on that score. Should we just dive straight into it?
Yeah, I think so.
So set the context for our listeners. How do we end up with? I mean, technically, it's not the Battle of the Nile, is it? It's the Battle of Abukir Bay.
Yeah.
How do we get there?
So at this point, we're still in the French Revolutionary Wars. Now, obviously, earlier in 1798, Napoleon had visited several of the Channel ports in France, which gave a little bit of weight to some of the rumors about him invading. Probably not England, but definitely Wales or somewhere else on the coast. And there was obviously also a rumor at this point of an expedition east. Um, and then the capture of a French ship actually kind of confirmed that that might be the case. There was a fleet being fitted out in Toulon at that point in time. Now, Napoleon's interest at this point was on Egypt, which is, obviously part of the Ottoman Empire at this point. And he didn't really see it as valuable to him necessarily in the way that you would imagine, but mostly as kind of a way of weakening the British Empire, really, by cutting off our kind of quickest route to India. But it also, I think, for him, provided a location for the French to then incidentally launch any attacks on India itself, to be honest. And it was kind of the key to a whole new empire for them. I think at this point in time, if you were to go and read into it with the directory and things, that a few people were also quite glad to send Napoleon off to some far-flung country, in all honesty. So he was sent off to capture Malta and Egypt, told to sort of get rid of the English from the Orient, build a canal at Suez. I mean, who would have thought? Who would have thought? But also just kind of head over there and keep on relatively good terms with the Sultan. But I think he also had plans to kind of create a new French colony, really. So amidst this fleet that was massing, they had scientists, they had engineers, architects, astronomers, historians, sort of some vibes going on, like loads of people on board the vessels to kind of set up this new colony, as well as your troops, obviously. Now, Earl St. Vincent, our favourite, John Jervis, was currently at this point in time running the blockade of Cadiz. when Nelson appeared, and I think he said that Nelson arriving gave him new life, which I always quite enjoy. Um, Now at this point, obviously Nelson uh, was still kind of keeping an eye on the French, but everything was sort of uncertain. In May 1798, there was a massive storm. His ship Vanguard was dismasted. Most of the frigates ran for shelter, and then I think the Vanguard was towed for something like 20 hours. That's how bad the damage was. It was extraordinary. Um, Now, at this point, obviously, Nelson is unaware that the French are kind of planning to leave Toulon. They're also fitting out in Marseille, Genoa, and a couple of other places. I think Ajaccio and Civitavecchio, I think, as well. So this is vast. I mean, they had 40,000, just under 40,000 soldiers, I think, around 10,000 sailors. And this was all going to be accompanied by 13 ships of the line, 14 frigates, and these sort of troop transports of three or 400 vessels as well, which is an extraordinarily large fleet, really. Nelson obviously headed back to Toulon after the storm and realized that it was empty, which was his first his first problem to deal with. So he split his squadron at the time, which was mostly made up of 74 gunners, into two kind of columns, and they started searching for the French. But he was basically one step behind for the entirety, which we'll go into in a little bit of detail later, I'm sure. But it was at this point that Nelson famously came out with his line that his distress from want of frigates is extreme, because obviously his frigates are gone and they're his reconnaissance, his scouting vessels, really. And I mean, they were so close chasing the French around the Mediterranean that at one point the French could even hear the British signal guns. And Nelson didn't realize that's how close they were. So, he's hunting them down all around the Mediterranean. He said that the devil's children have the devil's luck, and you can read his letters, and he's getting increasingly more irritated. So they headed down to Alexandria actually in June 1798, but they only found Turkish ships, so they left again. And then a couple of days later, Napoleon had arrived in Alexandria, the beginning of July. And then they took Alexandria the day later, and then Cairo later in the month, I think. So Nelson at this point has gone back to Naples. They're getting new water, fresh water, provisions, everything that they need, really, with some help from Emma Hamilton and the Queen of Naples, actually. When Nelson finally receives this kind of confirmation from Thomas Trowbridge that actually they were near Crete, so then Nelson realizes, oh, the French are near Crete, I know exactly where they're going, and then decides to head to Egypt for the second time in as many weeks.
You can just imagine, and you kind of explain it really nicely here, the level of frustration. Firstly, like the shock. You pitch up having had your ship dismasted, and you get back to Toulon and then go, oh
Oh,
bother. I think he might have maybe said, I don't know Nelson and his character well at all, but he might have said something a bit more stronger
this is
than oh bother. Um, but yeah, it's incredible how narrowly basically Napoleon escapes.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, matters of days, really.
because had they found the entirety of the French fleet, not just the ships of the line, but the
Mm.
transports as well, I'd imagine that would have been a bit of a bloodbath, would it?
Yeah, it would have been, well, I mean, like I said, just under 40,000 troops plus all the sailors as well. I mean, it would have been disastrous for them.
So you talked about Nelson. Obviously, he's kind of the hero, if you like, of this particular story. Where is he in his life story at this point? You mentioned Emma Hamilton. Where is he in terms of that relationship? He's minus an arm by now, but still
He,
has sight
he
in
is
both
minus an
eyes.
arm, yeah. So he'd lost it at Tenerife. So he actually met Emma Hamilton for the first time in 1793, actually, when he was captain of HMS Agamemnon, and had to go to Naples to basically persuade the king to send some troops to hold Toulon when it had actually been surrendered to the British, obviously quite a few years before. So he and Emma actually got on quite well. I think he wrote to his wife Fanny Liz that she had amiable manners. So yeah, they kept in touch. Obviously, it was Emma Hamilton and the Queen of Naples, who Emma was good friends with, that sort of helped out with Nelson's kind of urgent I guess, need for provisioning, really, when they went into Naples. And so she became kind of personally involved, but they weren't romantically attached at that point. It was actually after the Battle of the Nile. Spoiler alert, Nelson survives it, obviously. So there's our little spoiler number one, but he was quite unwell. So Emma and Sir William Hamilton actually took him into their home in Naples, Palazzo Sessa, and her mother basically sort of got him healthy and well again. And Nelson and Emma became really, really good friends. She actually used to wear a necklace with an N on it, subtle. And after the Nile, she obviously, as well as that, she had dresses with anchors on and sashes and threw parties in Nelson's honor and all this kind of stuff. And then obviously 1798, when they sort of helped with the evacuation to Palermo, is when they kind of started that romantic relationship, really.
Okay, so that's where we are in Nelson's life. Just kind of doing, well, it's almost like the admin before we set up the battle, isn't it? The British fleet, how's that looking at this point in time? Because they've just stocked up, but they're spending a lot of time kind of going backwards and forwards trying to chase the French and find out where just the hell they've gone. In terms of, I guess, British confidence, where are we on that kind of continuum? Because we always kind of think of the sense of by the time they get to Trafalgar, everybody knows that the British fancy themselves. Do they fancy themselves by this point, or are we still kind of on the route to that?
On the route, I would say. I mean, obviously, 1797, the year before, you've got the victory at Cape St. Vincent, which kind of is something that everybody needed, although that was against the Spanish, of course, allied with France at that point. Um, and that's really when Nelson kind of makes his name, albeit not ending up in the official official dispatches and having to self-promote in the way that Nelson does best. But at this point, obviously, people are very aware of what he's done, and they do want to serve with him. Um, and I think one of the things to kind of mention at this point is that it was really the kind of Nile campaign when Nelson's kind of band of brothers is first mentioned, and he's obviously quite important. He sees it quite important to have all of his captains together and understanding. So he regularly had all of his captains on board the Vanguard before we get to Abukir Bay. He discussed kind of plans, ideas, ways that he thought might work for attacking based on whether they were arriving in daylight hours or darkness. And I should add at this point, actually, a lot of battles weren't, regularly fought in darkness. It's very, very difficult, because you really need to know who you're firing on, which I'll come to a little bit later. But Nelson very much made sure that all of his captains were aware of kind of the position that they would be when they saw the enemy. So there weren't any, again, requirements for excessive signaling. And in addition to this, the gun crews were obviously also practicing daily at this point as well. So they were very, very well drilled by the time that they reached Egypt.
What about the French side? Who's in command and what sort of state is their morale in?
Yeah, so I think it's important to say that even, I guess, before Abukir Bay, the Nile, whatever you want to call it, the French were facing problems. I mean, during the revolution, they basically got rid of pretty much all of their senior officers who were either imprisoned or executed because they were aristocrats, and they were replaced by people who'd been at sea, which is great, but they, hadn't really led, and they didn't really have any command experience, was your first problem. Um, and something that I've touched on previously is that they also had a full corps of seaman gunners at one point, and then they got rid of it, and then suddenly went, "Oh, hang on a minute, we actually kind of need that." So they're struggling really at this point. I guess the Spanish as well at this point in time are also fairly weak in comparison to the Royal Navy. And like I said, of course, 1797, you've got the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, where they were defeated by this fleet, including Nelson. But the French, I mean, they were pretty significant, size wise, especially obviously when it came to transporting all of these troops. But I think it's important to think about the French fleet in relation to Egypt, because with no ships, you're not getting back to Europe. You're isolated. Um, all of your food, all of your supplies is coming by sea. One of the things that I think is most important is, I mean, the fact that it even happened at Abu Qir Bay, which is the mouth of the River Nile, because Alexandria was too shallow for most of the large ships. So they had to anchor out at Abu Qir. And Napoleon hadn't even really considered whether the country's only major harbour was actually big enough for his fleet in the first place, which kind of shows that, I guess, sea blindness to some extent. And that, I mean, the Navy was never his major interest, I guess you could really, which you obviously know more of than me. But the fact that, he's gone off to invade Egypt without even seeing whether the ships can be there safely and it's just an afterthought, is ridiculous. On top of that, you've got most of the sailors starving and ill because most of the troops had taken their food and their supplies ashore with them. Um, and Bruys, the French officer in command, had said, at one point they were floating between hope and despair. So, I mean, they weren't having a great time at all. Now, he was, I guess, mid-40s at this point. He'd been in the Navy since he was 13, so he actually did have a relatively long naval career compared to some others. Um, and he'd been in, yeah, I said he'd been in the Navy for a while, and his flagship at the Nile was the Lorient, 120 guns, 118, 120 guns, I think 120, which was his largest ship to date, really. But he'd said, that the crews were starving, they were weak, the ships were not really armed properly, and that it actually took courage to even be in command of them, which says everything you need to know, really. And I mean, whilst, as I said, that fleet strength is pretty impressive, you're actually undermanned, undercrewed. They've just taken people that they need to sort of add to a quota and get numbers, really, rather than experienced sailors. And by the time he heard about the British arriving, he basically couldn't recover any of the time. He'd lost sort of fanning about trying to get people back from shore because most of them had gone ashore. And he was just kind of stuck waiting for Nelson and the fleet to kind of arrive and pick him off, essentially. The wind at this point is also in the favour of the British fleet, coming from the, here, this will test me, southeast, I think southeasterly wind. Um, or coming, yeah. And they couldn't go anywhere. They were just stuck.
Okay, so to say that they're in a pickle puts it mildly.
Yeah.
Um, I'm trying to resist the temptation to rabbit hole because people have sort of started to
We love a rabbit hole.
um, request shorter episodes. But just so Lorient, 120 guns.
Yeah.
For context for folks, Victory's 100, I want to say.
104, yeah.
104.
So
So we're
Lorient
talking,
is huge. And I mean, most of Nelson's guns are 74 at the Nile, just for, and, two decks. Lorient would have been three.
so a big flagship in the mix
Yeah,
there.
absolutely.
And we'll talk more about Lorient's very tragic fate in a bit. I want to pick up on something that you mentioned, which is the planning that Nelson
Mhm.
sticks into this, and we'll talk more about how you avoid firing on your own people in the dark in a bit. But one of the things that I think will surprise folks is that the original plan is different to the one that we know about, what I sort of refer to as the balls of steel moment. So talk us through that strategy and what he's kind of initially intending to do.
Yeah, so you get to the beginning of August, 1st of August, and someone basically on HMS Zealous has spotted the French at this point. So they've got 13 ships anchored in a sort of slight curve. Um, and unfortunately, a lot of their guns had been landed over onto an island to kind of protect them, but the range was not going to be sufficient, unfortunately. So Nelson's plan was essentially to kind of attack them at the rear and the center. So the ships would anchor at the stern. They had ropes attached to their anchor cables to keep them basically at the right angle for firing effectively, which is actually quite unusual because anchoring isn't generally done while you're while you're still moving. You're usually almost at a stop, if not stopped, by the time you anchored. And so essentially they're dropping their anchors in the hope that it will catch, and then that anchor cable would obviously hold. So some of the ships actually managed to succeed in this, and some of them didn't. So um, we'll go into it a little bit later. But the Bellerophon obviously couldn't actually slow down at all and ended up basically stuck next to Lorient, which obviously is a pretty large ship. And she had a nightmare during the battle, really. She was dismasted, she was on fire, captain's unconscious, most of the lieutenants are wounded or dead. And then at one point, there's a 13-year-old midshipman in charge. So um yeah, so
Please tell
basically
me his name was Blakely.
oh, oh, we love him, Blakeney.
That was a Master
Yeah,
and
so,
Commander reference for people who don't realize.
yeah.
But sorry, carry on, Kate.
Yeah, so the plan essentially was that obviously once they've destroyed one of the enemy ships from that kind of position, they'd then move down the line to the next sitting duck, as it were. So we mentioned about the lights, and they'd put basically distinctive lights on all of the mizzen masts, which would then identify them as British ships, so they knew not to fire on them, which was obviously incredibly practical given that you're about to start a battle in the darkness, which again it didn't tend to happen very often. So that in itself was interesting, and all the captains were also being told on their way in to basically measure the depth of the water because there were shallows and shoals, just to make sure that they didn't end up grounding, really running aground, going.
Well, this is the incredible thing for me, and this is why we're gonna talk about the balls of steel moment. Basically, people, I want to do a mug like Murat being all balls and no brains. I want to do something about the Battle of the Nile and Nelson's balls of steel moment. So if you're kind of digging the what's the word that I'm looking for, the sound bite, then let me know in the comments if you need a balls of steel mug in your life. Actually, when you phrase it like that, it sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? But anyway, um, what am I referring to with the balls of steel moment? For those who don't know, it's when he decides, oh look, the French fleet's at anchor and they're able to swing on
Mhm.
their anchors. So therefore, there's space around the back of them. I'll just send my guys around the back.
Literally.
Um, which, and you go, well, yeah, so what? But Kate, you've just mentioned it. Shoals, they are anchored in a bay.
Yeah.
And to me, and I will be the first to acknowledge, I am not remotely nautically minded. That feels very much like threading the needle whilst you're wearing mittens and having somebody take pot shots at you. That's what it kind of seems like to me. Is it quite as treacherous as that? I mean, I
Yeah, I
would
mean, you're not.
instantly go, well, ships are underground, so yes, but you know better than I do.
Yeah, I mean, you're not far off. The whole point of anchoring is that you should have a 360-degree ability for your ship to swing in the wind. So they basically managed to completely take advantage of the fact that they know the French are anchored, so they know there's that much space. Now, the French at this point, like I said, are kind of moored in a line south from those shallows. So they were essentially just I don't have a picture, obviously I can't show you a picture here, but the if you look at the plan of battle, then you can see exactly where they were. And this is happening in such a small area, a very, very small area, which is incredible in itself when you consider the size of these ships. But essentially they had their 13 ships in a line. Lorient was kind of in the middle. And then some of their larger, more powerful ships are at the rear, which is where Bruys kind of thought an attack would come if it was going to. Um, I don't think he was expecting what happened at all, unfortunately. So he didn't have any of his frigates at sea to kind of let him know that this was happening. The Guerriere basically hadn't even anchored in close enough to the shoals. The ships weren't close enough to give any supporting fire to each other, but he seemed quite happy with it. And I mean, earlier in July, he'd actually written to Napoleon saying that he had a strong position in case he had to fight, which he didn't. Um, and also, I mean, the French were entirely unprepared for battle to begin with. They'd sent sailors ashore to try and find food and water because they didn't have any. The decks were full of luggage and stores for this new colony, in inverted commas. And on top of that, you've got badly trained crews who are unwell and hungry. Bruys had dysentery, so I'm sure he wasn't the only one suffering at this point either. I mean, they're in a miserable state. So yeah, because these French ships are all just anchored at the bow, it meant that there was enough depth for those ships to just spin if they needed to in the wind. And Thomas Foley on the Goliath realized this very quickly. Um, and took advantage of it, really, leading kind of the line, I guess, between the French fleet and the land, which they weren't expecting. They hadn't even run out any of their guns, so they managed to get off a broadside into the Guerriere without anyone even coming back.
It does sound like the perfect storm of a catalogue of
Uh-huh.
cock-ups from the French. Like if you could have a diagram of choices, and every single time you make the wrong choice, that basically feels like what the French do at the Nile. Um, so the French kind of see this fleet bearing down on them eventually. Sun's starting to go down, but it must have been pretty obvious at some point that, oh, look, the British are coming. Do I can't quite work out what the plan is because, from what I understand, there's an order to set sail that then gets countermanded. Um, but then equally, from what you're saying, they Bruey's pretty confident. You've got he's writing to Napoleon, going, yeah, strong place to fight, because that's a comment that aged really well. Um, what's what actually what is the French plan? Because I don't understand it. That's basically my question.
I mean, he thinks he's happy and he's got, like I said, he's got this strong position to fight and I guess, he's set for a battle. But like I said, that doesn't happen because Thomas Foley quickly realizes there's space and takes it upon himself to go, actually, um, I think this is what we need to do. So he heads down in the Goliath, between the French fleet and the land, which obviously, like I said, they weren't expecting. They hadn't run out any of their guns. They had all these stores on board. Um, he fired on Guerriere and then anchored on the kind of inside of Conquerant, which was the second French ship. Then Hood went by, along with a couple of others, including Sir James Saumarez, who at this point is Nelson's second in command. And then they went in as well. And basically, it meant that they could then be attacked on two sides, the French, before they even could get any support, really. So Nelson on Vanguard attacked from the sort of seaward side, if you're imagining it with the map. Um, and Nelson's other captain on the Theseus, the Miller, is attacking from the landward side, and they're both doing this at basically pretty much sunset. And then the rest of the ships will just follow on down the line and take their position against all of the targets, apart from Thomas Trowbridge on Culloden, who unfortunately doesn't manage to engage the enemy at all because he gets stuck on the shoals.
Does he have a lot of egg on his face after the battle, or do people kind of go, "Nah, fair enough. That was a legitimate cause for you not being in the battle"? Because
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
mean, he managed to pass on the information really, really quickly. So he's told two other or signaled to two other ships, and they managed to divert before the same thing happened to them. So actually, he stopped them from getting stuck. He did try to get out of it using some clever anchoring and stuff, but it didn't go anywhere, unfortunately. But he did manage to stop a couple of other ships grounding as well, which swings and roundabouts, I guess.
if the British hadn't been able to get round the back, if you like,
Hmm.
technical term there, I'm sure that's exactly what it's called in naval tactical circles. Um, but without that, would Nelson's plan still have worked? Bearing in mind what you're saying about, half the crews are on the shore, half the guns aren't even on the pigging ships. Was this actually a done deal that all Nelson needed to do was close, and then it became a question of just how much of an evisceration this was going to be for this fleet? Or actually, does it all swing on the fact that Foley identifies this opportunity and just seizes it?
I mean, personally, I think it would have still been a British victory purely on the basis of the ill preparedness, I guess, of the French. Um, you've also, I mean, if you consider how many people it takes to bring up an anchor, you see these films where the anchor's just coming up incredibly quickly. If you use HMS Victory as an example, I mean, obviously she's larger than most of all the 74 guns, obviously, but these anchors, it could take up to 6 hours to pull up HMS Victory's largest anchor, and that's with, I think, 300 people on Yeah, it's not a quick thing. So the other option that you have, of course, is to cut your anchor away. So you'd attach a buoy to it so that you could go back and get it later, and you just cut the anchor cable because it was quicker than actually pulling your anchor up. But they're both still time consuming, you know?
6 hours to pull up
Yeah.
an anchor.
So all of
What?
is it Pirates of the Caribbean where they're just whizzing it up? It's yeah, no, absolute nonsense, unfortunately. Myth busting to the max. But yeah, if you look at the capstans on Victory and you get more of an idea of the length of the bars that go into it, then you suddenly realize how many people you're needing to do that. Which is why a lot of people would cut it, attach a buoy to it, and go back because anchors are expensive, man. You don't want to leave them behind.
You do not. But also there's a lot of rope attached to it. And I know
Uh-huh.
like, rope is a thing and all of that, but we're not just
Even
talking
if-
like,
even just cutting an anchor cable, if you're talking your largest anchors on something like Victory, I mean, they're like tree trunks. It's not you haven't got a power saw. Do you know what I mean? It's going to take you a while even to cut through an anchor cable to get going. So there's not really a lot you can do in that situation apart from fight as best you can, which in their defense, the French did. Um,
I mean, that was going to be my next question, I guess. How do the two sides match up? Is this just a walkover? Um, Considering the French have got disease, fractions of their crew, guns in random islands trying to protect approaches but not succeeding, not being able to provide mutual fire support. Is this just an absolute cakewalk? Or, do the French kind of really make, I mean, you mentioned, for example, Bellerophon.
mhm.
Is Bellerophon just unlucky, or do the French really kind of give the British something to think about?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at them in terms of number, they both had 13 ships of the line. So that in that regard, they're even. But like I said, the French just weren't prepared at all. They weren't chained to each other. They weren't anchored in the best place. And I mean, like I said, this is why they were able to be attacked. And for the first few ships, at least, the British were opening fire completely unreturned. They couldn't fire back because none of their guns were run out on that side at all. And like I said, Bellerophon was at this point dismasted. She was on fire, and lots of her crew were either wounded or dead. If you look at the gun size, I guess that would be the next most interesting thing. I guess on the British ships, your largest guns are 32 pounders and the French are 36 pounders, which obviously are larger. But if you're not firing them effectively, doesn't make much of a difference. I think one thing that is really interesting that I have had to write it down because I'm really bad with numbers, but I know that you'll appreciate it because Waterloo will get a mention. Is that the British ships had 1,028 guns between them. The French had 1,098. So that's 2,126 guns. At Waterloo, Napoleon had 252 guns and the Allies just 156. So when you compare that, plus the fact it's at nighttime, it would have just been like a massive fireworks display, honestly.
Well, this is the thing that always baffles me every time I go and see Victory. Just the thought that a single broadside probably expelled more ironwork than all of the shot at
Yeah,
Waterloo, period.
it's
Um,
absolutely incredible. And when you consider the smoke and the noise, yeah, well, I mean, you can't even imagine it really.
this is why I love that YouTube video where they've fitted blanks to all of
So I think it was from the
guns.
200th anniversary, wasn't it, of
Yeah,
Trafalgar along
yeah.
Victory. That is very cool.
If folks don't know about it, Google it. HMS Victory broadside. It looks stunning. Um, and I do hope they do another one at some point because it is
That would
just
be good.
incredible.
Maybe a
I
Victory broadside once she's been fully refurbished in
Yes,
another
as as
decade.
as part of a ceremony. There we
Mm.
go. We'll write to important people because they'll listen to us for sure.
No, 100%.
Yeah, definitely not. Speaking of sort of loud bangs, Lorient, she burns, and this is I always think a ship burning is just tragic because if you're stuck on one of these, you know what it means. Um, just give people an indication of, in case they're not kind of tuned into this and maybe they're listening to, a show about 18th century naval warfare for the first time, why why is this just so utterly horrific?
Well, I mean, ships burning and exploding, no matter who it is, there's always that kind of it could be us thought, I think, because they're all in, I was about to say they're all in the same boat. That's terrible, isn't it? But they are all in the same situation, where it could happen to them. And it happened to various ships over the years, just accidents or lanterns catching fire. It doesn't take a lot to set one of these ships on fire. And Lorient catches fire at about 10 o'clock at night, I think, partly because the Bellerophon are firing on her as best they can, but also they'd left a load of tar and pitch and things on board the deck from where they were doing some refurbishment while they were there. It caught fire and then sadly she exploded. And they said that they heard the explosion and saw the flash in Alexandria, which is I think 9 miles away, something like that, which is insane, really, when you think about it. Like that is not a small explosion by any stretch of the imagination. Now, they said that supposedly there was treasure looted by Napoleon from Malta on board. I don't know how true that is, but they believe that was on board and lost. But unfortunately, so most of her ship's company. I think 100 of them out of around 1,000, complement of 1,000, survived. It was just awful. Um, there was Bruys at this point who'd lost both of his legs, bless him. He was sat down with tourniquets on his stumps in an armchair. Then he was killed by a cannonball. Like he was fighting until the bitter end, really. Good naval term there, sorry. Um, and Nelson actually ordered his one undamaged boat to go and get what crew members that he could from the water. But like I said, only 100 of them survived. It was it was awful. One thing I will say here about Nelson, though, as well, which does need mentioning, is that the wood from the mainmast of Lorient actually became his coffin. Um, he was buried in the mast, the mainmast wood from Lorient, which is kind of fitting, but also slightly morbid. I think there's also obviously at this point worth mentioning the story of the child spotted on the poop deck of the ship.
I'm going to ask
Um,
about this, the boy who stood on the burning deck. Is this
yeah,
true or is it a myth?
Yeah, no, it is. There was a 10-year-old son of Commodore Casabianca, and I think most people know that, well, the line that you just said, the boy stood on the burning deck. He did throw himself into the sea, which the poem doesn't actually say. The poem says he stayed on board trying to hear for his father, who'd tragically already died. But he did jump into the water. Unfortunately, when she exploded, that was the end of him. Um, the French at this point, realizing that she was going to explode, had cut a lot of their cables and got as far away as possible. And the British ships were closing their gun ports because they knew what was going to happen. Like the force of that as well is would have just been astounding, really.
Can I ask about the etiquette around a ship burning? And people will think I completely lost it at this point, but there are two ways to um, think about this. One is you see a ship burning and you go, "Oh my God, um, poor sods on board." And at that point, maybe you don't target the burning ship, not least because, as you say, you're kind of bracing yourself for what you think might happen. There's another argument, I guess, which is the purely Machiavellian argument of I am here to destroy the enemy. If I fire on that ship as it burns, it will hamper the abilities of the crew to put out that fire and therefore try and get itself back in the fight. So, is there a kind of polite, unspoken, or maybe even just kind of an assumed sort of etiquette of, look, if the ship's burning, leave us the hell alone so that we can all try and not die? Does that exist? Or is like tactics a more kind of brutal and more pressing priority?
Yeah, I mean, whether it's written down or not, there's not much point. By the point, there's the famous painting of Lorient on fire by Thomas Looney, which is worth looking at. But once it gets to that point, there's no point wasting your shot on it in the nicest way possible. Um, and I think the British were obviously at this point also trying to deal with secondary fires from wreckage that had started on the Swift Shore, the Alexander, and the Franklin. So they're trying to put fires out whilst Lorient is burning. Obviously, they've got men jumping in the water. They're putting there are a few rafts going ashore, but people were trying to get them out of the water. Like I said, Nelson sent orders that the boats were going to get them out of the water. Um, but then within a few minutes, they started firing all of the ships. Like, oh well, that's done. Right, back to business. So they didn't fire on Lorient after she'd started burning to that extent, but they didn't wait very long before firing on everybody else.
So how does that affect French morale and French capacity? I suppose part of the question is where is Lorient in that line, which I don't know because I don't actually have a battle map in front of me. But
In the
yeah,
center, really. So she was sort of in
okay,
the center of their fleet, really.
that was kind of my gut, but I was kind of thinking, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about there, Zach. So just ask the question. So Lorient goes up. Presumably the first half of the line has been really viciously engaged by this point.
It's worth
How
mentioning as well, I think, that Nelson did actually get injured at the Nile. I mean, he thought in his dramatic way that he died and asked that letters be written for his wife and things. But actually, this is pretty early in the action. A bit of metal hit his head, and then so much blood came down, and he couldn't see, and he thought he'd gone blind and all this kind of stuff. It was a flap of skin, essentially, was hanging down, and there was a lot of blood. But I think the surgeon, went to go and help him, and Nelson was like, "No, no, I'll wait my turn." But then he did go and check, and it was pretty messy, but he got stitched up and then went back up just before Lorient caught caught fire. Um, there's actually a really, really good painting. Nelson apparently didn't like it and asked for the scar to be painted over if you go to the Admiralty boardroom. Which
Nelson Vane, what?
yeah, I know. I can't even remember what the new government is it Biz? It's not Biz. Is it the Department for Trade now? But basically, the old Admiralty boardroom. There's this famous painting that they discovered had been painted over of the scar, and then they discovered the painting had the scar in it. And it's not a very flattering painting of Nelson, but supposedly fairly accurate.
Interesting. Yeah, Nelson not one to kind of embrace the Cromwellian warts and all methodology of painting, for sure. Um, and also I'm not it feels to me we should probably save this for the Nelson episode, but it does feel to me that Nelson likes to be a bit melodramatic about
100%. So
yeah.
very much so. Yeah.
He's got this kind of death complex almost. Um, I feel all the way through his
Mhm.
career, like every injury, oh, I'm about to die. Remember me in my heroic moment.
Oh,
Um,
I'm alive actually.
yeah. Uh, talking about ends, how does
Yeah.
it end for the French? How do we, we've got sort of to the point where Lorient goes up at about 10 o'clock. Is that the point at which the French go, nah, it's all over. Flagship's gone. First
No.
half of the line ripped out. We're going to run away now because it's all over. Or do they, or can't they run away? I guess is another point. The wind direction. It's not quite as simple as fire up the engines. We're going wherever the British aren't. What is the story of the rest of the battle?
I mean, it carried on throughout the night. Some of the ships were dismasted, some of them had lost lots of people. One of the other French officers had also lost both of his legs, and I think he was propped up on the deck in a bucket to kind of keep himself up. Um, and it carried on into the morning, really. So they stopped for a very brief period where people weren't engaging each other, but it was just sort of that maneuvering into position, really. Like I said, it carried on into the morning and then into the afternoon, really. And Nelson had said victory isn't a name strong enough for such a scene in his, again, usual. He'd be a great lots of sound bites for Nelson, honestly. If you were running as an MP and you needed that on all your motivational posters, he has many, but I think by the end of the battle, of the 13 French ships of the line and the four frigates, all of them but four were either sunk, on fire, held as prizes, or grounded. Um, and actually, two of the, like, I think four escaped, and two of those were frigates. So the ships of the line were in a bad way. And actually, those two that escaped went off with Villeneuve, who, of course, later served against Nelson at Trafalgar. And he managed to get away pretty much scot-free, unpursued, because basically none of our ships were also in any condition to be chasing at this point. Everyone was incredibly damaged. I think the Theseus chased for a little bit and then just got recalled by Nelson to come back, like let them go, sort of thing. But yeah, so the French had lost Bruys, obviously, but they'd also had 9 of their 13 captains killed, which is a pretty shocking state of affairs, really.
Is that a testament to just an unwillingness to give in, or is that just a reflection of the fact that the the situation that they face means that if they fight, they're just going to get ripped apart? Which is it?
I mean, I think a lot of it just came down to the fact that they were just incredibly unlucky, really. They were just, I mean, they were fighting as much as they could with what they had, which wasn't sufficient, really, to be doing that. It's a shame, really. I mean, they probably would have put up a much better fight.
So talk us through the impact that all of this has. I guess both for the Royal Navy, but also in terms of the wider strategic situation. I mean, obviously, we all know how this kind of leaves Napoleon basically screwed, stranded
Yeah.
in Egypt. He will then go and launch his campaign up into the Near East, and then that's going to fail, and then he's going to give up and run home. Whereas, had that not happened, maybe he'd have been stuck in, I don't know, Iran or somewhere trying to sort of make his Alexander the Great thing happen, had he had the supplies. So obviously, there's a lot of sort of impact for Napoleon there.
Uh-huh.
But I'm thinking in terms of sort of the strategic impact in the Med. This is, we're talking 14 ships of the line, sorry, 13 ships of the line of the French Mediterranean fleet. That's a lot to have go in one fell swoop. So how does this sort of change the strategic situation in the Med?
Yeah, I mean, so Napoleon actually blamed Bruys, despite being dead, which feels a bit unfair for this failure, I guess, in terms of tactics, and also very unfairly said that the French fleet should have been at sea and not anchored at Aboukir at all, which I think is very unfair considering that A, it was his poor planning that meant they were there in the first place. And secondly, they actually said, we want to go to Corfu, get some more supplies and ships. And Napoleon said no. So it's his fault they were there in the first place. But yeah, essentially Nelson basically just removed the French army's link to Europe, all of their source of supplies, means of escape. And at this point, British naval power wasn't weak, but obviously since France allied with Spain, it was tenuous, I guess, was then kind of restored and they were the dominant force again. But as you said, Napoleon and his troops are stranded at this point. So um, I think at one point the local people were referring to him as Ali Bonaparte, I read somewhere, and he was wearing turbans and all sorts. But they were there till the French were there till 1801, and Napoleon left, I think, 1799. Um, but I remember reading somewhere that actually they did, while they were sort of holding control of Egypt, I guess, for a few years, they did quite a lot of archaeological work, including finding what we now call the Rosetta Stone, which is actually, pretty interesting in itself. So it wasn't a complete complete loss in hindsight for us, at least. It's great to have that, but for him, he was obviously having a bit of a mare.
But of course, it all works out for Napoleon because he manages to one shot the Ottoman general with falling masonry off the pyramid. And if you need more on that episode, then watch that highly authoritative film, Napoleon by Ridley Scott, because that tells you everything that you need to know.
I'm now wondering
Um,
if you get the Ridley Scott diss track into every possible podcast, like people trying to get Eurovision into their uni dissertations and things.
There's always a way. There's always a way you can take the piss. People are bored of me taking the piss, but at this point, it's become a meme. Let's talk about the impact for Nelson personally. He's
Nelson did very well. It was great for him. He basically became a celebrity. I don't know who we'd compare him to today. I can't really think of any celebrities that I don't think, for the most part, are awful. But he was made Baron Nelson of the Nile, firstly, by George III. The Ottoman Emperor Selim III gave him the Order of the Turkish Crescent after the battle, which is the one you can see on his uniform with the kind of crescent moon. Um, and then the King of Naples made him Duke of Bronte. Now, like I said, he went back to Naples feeling, a bit rough, not doing too well to recover. And then, like I said, Emma Hamilton nursed him back to health through parties in his honor and all this kind of stuff. But I think this is really the kind of point where, I mean, Nelson was already quite famous, but this is the one that kind of skyrocketed him into everyone knowing who he was. I mean, there are letters written by sailors that were at the battle, purely that wrote letters after the battle just so that they could document the fact that they had been there with Nelson, because they wanted it known that they'd served with Nelson. Um, and that kind of tells you everything you need to know, really. Like I said, this is the first kind of reference of his band of brothers, which obviously we still talk about um, today, and it kind of gives that insight into his sort of character and his enthusiasm, I guess, and how he works with everybody. Um, yeah, it goes on obviously to Trafalgar, and we sadly know what happens there, but it gives an idea of exactly how Nelson wanted to work and how everyone wanted to work with him. And it was by this point that everyone kind of understood that they were supposed to be that kind of well-disciplined, well-honed fighting machine, really.
so in some respects, is this a culmination of everything that both Nelson and the Royal Navy as a whole have been working towards, or is this just a demonstration of the fact that there's a formula that the British develop up to this point that has just reached its absolute peak at some point by the sort of later 1790s?
Well, I think it's also important to think about the fact that the British fleet are obviously fed and watered well. Their men are in health, they're kept in good kind of fighting condition, their ships are seaworthy, and all of this kind of logistics, which is obviously really important, comes into it really. And yeah, I think at this point people are obviously very, very aware of what he's doing, and even the French are saying, oh, actually, that was quite impressive. But obviously also then criticizing their own situation. But I do still find it astounding that Napoleon tried to put the blame on everybody but himself for this one, when actually the whole reason they were at Abu Qir Bay in the first place was because he hadn't done his prior preparation and planning and all that.
Napoleon blaming other people. Who would have thought it? There's always a way that we can end on a dig at Napoleon on this podcast, and there we have found it. Kate, it's always an absolute joy to have you on the show. You do actually have a book out, but it's not a sort of Nelsonian Navy boaty book. So we're going to plug it
There
because
are
why
actually
not?
there is some maritime history in there. So there are multiple chapters. I've obviously only edited it along with a couple of people from the Royal Navy Strategic Studies Centre, called Maritime Britain in the 21st Century. But there are chapters on I don't know, the art of admiralty, on subsea cables, on maritime art and culture, and everything that kind of makes us a wonderful island nation, really, to kind of remind people that we are an island and the sea is important, and the maritime sphere is one that needs to be studied. But yeah, we've got I can't even, this is really bad, isn't it? I think I want to say about 20 contributors.
So there you go, folks. Maritime Britain in the 21st Century, available wherever you get your books. Google it. Apologies, I don't know the publisher off the top of my head. But just people don't go and rely on Uncle Jeff. I mean, go and buy the book, and if you need to buy it through Uncle Jeff, that's Jeff Bezos at Amazon, by the way. Then sure, go do that. But please do go and support the folks who are kind enough to come on the show. Kate, always a joy talking to you. We will do a Life of Nelson part 1 in the not too distant future. But as ever, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Folks, if you've enjoyed this show, please do me a favor. Head over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave a 5-star review. If you're not a regular listener, remember to hit that subscribe button so you can find your way back. All of those things are incredibly powerful in helping this show to reach a wider audience. Much love, as ever, to all my Patreon supporters. Shout outs to my mentioned in Dispatches patrons Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Coulson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Graylick, Ted Andrews, David Milinski, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Merlon, and Darla Vincent. And the Admirals, John Haynes, Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Ned Campbell, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Mark Chestnut, and Jason Morn. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zack White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.